All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA IAJO speaker session entitled On the New War Ecology. And I'd also like to thank today's speaker, Dr. Matthew Ford, for taking the time to present. So before we begin, just a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll be having a virtual Q&A session at the conclusion of the brief. So throughout the presentation or during the Q&A, feel free to submit your question through the live event Q&A chat. It's a chat icon and it has 2 overlapping speech bubbles and 1 as a question mark. Also be sure to type in your name and affiliation before you submit your question, or if you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, feel free to submit your question anonymously. You can also vote on which questions you'd like to be addressed most by hitting the like button next to that question. So now I'm going to briefly introduce today's speaker before I turn the floor over to him. Dr. Matthew Ford is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Sussex. His research interests focus on military innovation, socio-technical change, the epistemology of battle and strategy, and he's also written extensively about military technical change, especially as it relates to infantry and their experience of battle. Finally, he's currently co-authoring a book entitled Radical War, Data, Attention, and Control in the 21st Century. So Dr. Ford, I'm going to turn the floor over to you now.
Thanks, Nicole. Let me just share my screen. Right, here we are. Right, well, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Nicole said, my name is Dr. Matthew Ford. I work in the Department of International Relations at the University of Sussex. Please take a note of my contact details, as I very much welcome follow-up conversations after my presentation. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a particular feature of my forthcoming book, Radical War. To help you make sense of my presentation, I want to draw your attention to how radical war is framed. The idea for the book was conceived before COVID, but the concepts have since matured during the pandemic. And today, I'm going to talk to you about a key aspect of the book that I call the New War Ecology. Specifically, I want to take you on a journey around this landscape. The key aspects of this landscape that I will focus on and that shape my presentation can be boiled down to data, attention, and control. Out of this analysis, a number of themes have emerged that now form part of my ongoing research agenda, and if there's time and interest, then I'd be happy to revisit this later on. So why does all this matter? This matters because I want to take you this matters because I want to get inside the logic of this quote. This statement, this quote, in fact, if you're dropping bombs, then you've already lost. This statement was made to me by some of your colleagues from the US Air Force in a conversation I had following a 4-day UK MOD workshop on multi-domain integration. And the question I want to ask is, how are we supposed to make sense of this sentence? In many respects, the ideas run counter to our conventional understanding of what armed forces is designed to do, to defend national interests and deter adversaries from engaging in military activity that leads to escalation and war. So what's curious about this statement is that the one thing that is core to what is core to what you do has collapsed into itself, so that by acting you are also delegitimizing military practice. My presentation is about trying to unpack the layers of meaning that frame this statement, with the ambition to help you to see how military power and its representation produce political effects in the new war ecology. The trajectory of radical war emerges out of my first book called Weapon of Choice. Having undertaken detailed research into small arms and the culture of military innovation, my research evolved from the analog to the digital domain. This agenda is reflected in the work of my co-author, Professor Andrew Hoskins from the University of Glasgow, who shares my interest in media and modern war. So, in an effort to help you break into the idea of the new war ecology, this presentation is organised in terms of a problem set that I imagine many of you are familiar with. I then want to discuss war and its representation as framed in terms of mainstream media and social media. In particular, I want to discuss the way changes in the production, publication, and consumption of media has changed now that smartphone technology is widely available. I will then link this back to cycles of media production, comparing 20th and 21st century media cycles and their disruptive effects on how war is represented and how this frames memory decay. This will help me to explain the flux of representation that contributes to a certain unease and a breakdown in shared understandings about the world. Finally, I will feed this back into how the armed forces process data and archives, especially in relation to targeting and the lessons learned cycles. In my conclusion, I will explore aspects of the new war ecology before finishing on a fuller definition of radical war. So to come back to my initial provocation then, how to make sense of if you're dropping bombs, then you've already lost. My starting place for framing this is the NGO Air Wars. Air Wars is based in Southeast London on the campus of Goldsmiths University, a part of the University of London. I've met Chris Woods, the founder and director, and the operation he has set up is really very impressive. Applying a method set that would be familiar to those working in intelligence collection and analysis, or maybe just good investigative journalism, it seems to me that Air Wars has developed a battle damage assessment methodology that arguably is even more precise than the methods effectively being used by the armed forces themselves. And Air Wars have done this using open source intelligence from stringers, from people self-reporting, and from evidence posted by online by people participating directly on the front lines. The result is that they can see 3 body counts from the Syrian civil war. Syrians themselves estimate 30,000 casualties from the air campaigns. Air Wars can account for around 8,000. But most importantly, Air Wars have successfully managed to persuade Congress that the US Armed Forces need to properly account for the number of civilian casualties caused by the air campaign. And as you can see, this has led the Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve to self-report on air operations and admit that their air campaign has produced around 1,400 civilian casualties. At the same time, in their 2020 annual report, Air Wars have also expressed the concern that the armed forces are inadequate to keeping their proper records, or if they do keep them, that they prefer to institutionally forget inconvenient learning points. And this is a serious problem. Digitization offers the possibility that records can be kept and made more accessible. At the same time, there is so much data that it's hard to keep control of it all. Clearly, in a context of paying out compensation, or worse, having to defend the armed forces from allegations of unlawful killing or war crimes, it is important to maintain accurate records. In the UK, for instance, the British Army found itself accused of institutionally forgetting the 5 torture techniques which had been banned in the 1970s following internment in Northern Ireland. To find that these same techniques had then been used by elements of the British Army in the unlawful killing of Baha Musa in Iraq in 2003 only fuels speculation that the armed forces are happy to forget inconvenient details. Maintaining an archive is therefore important. It frames learning lessons and ensures accountability, which in turn implies the legitimate use of armed force. So that raises the question as to what we can learn from Air Wars. What does this case study tell us about the relationship between dropping bombs and the legitimate use of military power? Firstly, it seems to me that open source intelligence guarantees that if someone has done something accidental, stupid, or unlawful, it will probably come out. Secondly, you can't improve performance or defend yourself in court without good record keeping. Finally, we might conclude that in the current operating environment, NGOs have shown that they can be as effective at battle damage assessment as the armed forces. Air Wars, in my opinion, boils down the problem of using military power in the context of a media ecology you might shape, but you cannot control. You might say it was ever thus, but there are good reasons why we need to develop a good understanding of what is going on in the present to see why the contemporary moment is entirely new. So we need to study war and why do we need to study war and its representation? It seems to me that in the current operating environment, the means by which war is represented cannot be controlled by the state. Put simply, this is because top-down processes of media production have been supplanted by people and their smartphones. Even in authoritarian countries, controlling messages takes you only so far. In these media ecologies, sophisticated political communication strategies are needed to misdirect or reframe messages. But this aside, the armed forces of the West are not working for authoritarian regimes. They are defending open societies, not Sparta. So it is important then to think about war and its representation. And as a way of engaging in that, I want to start by comparing and contrasting media representation in the 20th century with media representation in the 21st. Specifically, I'm using this very conventional, almost 1950s depiction of a newspaper organization to emphasize the hierarchical and multi-layered structure that in the 20th century mediated how the news became the news. This framing of how the news cycle works, this framing of the news cycle works on a 24-hour basis. There are deadlines. The newspaper is published overnight for distribution in the morning. This chart smacks of editorial process, of fact-checking, of there being established ways of working, that there are rules. This is a fixed technology with fixed schedules. By contrast, the smartphone has turned the mainstream media publication model on its head. People produce, publish, and consume media all from one device. They don't need sophisticated editorial processes or lawyers telling them what they can and cannot publish. They participate in the production and consumption of media, and they do it from anywhere they can get a Wi-Fi or a network signal. And they do it at any time during the day, every day. It produces content that is out of sync with the mainstream media cycle. It does not fit within a set schedule and relies on a heavily dynamic technology infrastructure that can produce global effects very quickly. This has changed the media ecology and reworked mainstream media business models. This new war ecology is asynchronous. It is always on, and consequently, it has accelerated the process of information dissemination and amplification. And as several commentators who have given talks to you will have observed already, it has underwritten the spread of disinformation and misinformation, creating networks of cascading propaganda. It has become easier to layer and launder lies into the news, create false narratives, and promote polarization in political debate. This is reinforced by the structures of social media itself, which are designed to give everyone a voice that balances the views of the experts with those of the general public. And all of this lends itself to influencers and PR and new forms of engagement. In one device, then, people have the capacity to participate in war in a way that they never have been previously. As Professor Daniel Miller, an anthropologist from University College London, noted on the release of a recent study, the smartphone is no longer just a device that we use, it's become the place where we live. In this context, then, this highly portable device helps participants engage in war as keyboard warriors, as propagandists, by offering direction to terrorists, by providing GPS coordinates and data points for targeteers. The smartphone is a sensor, and it is part of a wider redrafting of the new war ecology. It extends the emerging military Internet of Things into the population at large. In this respect, war is participative, whether we are witting participants or not. Obviously, not everyone is online. As you'll appreciate if you've watched Saturday Night Live, The Daily Show or The Apprentice. However, social media and mainstream media interact and amplify each other, pointing to the fact that the online and offline worlds are more closely engaged than is typically acknowledged. And this is most clearly seen in the way that the information infrastructures support daily life. People participate in their own surveillance because there are benefits from being online. Only online can you access goods and services more easily, more cheaply, and in a way that's more convenient. At what point do any of these critical infrastructures not involve some touch points with the internet? The information infrastructures that underwrite this network of relationships is complex. The stack that enables it is layered across multiple public and private interfaces. This offers more attack surfaces for the armed forces, but it also creates more dependencies and vulnerabilities. Moreover, all the while the benefits of going online outweigh the concerns for data privacy, the more people are going to go online. Data deeply mediates everything we see and do, and processes of datafication brought about by the Internet of Things will only drive this process of interweaving analog and digital lives even further. And the disintermediating forces that Silicon Valley have unleashed on society cannot be avoided by the armed forces. Digitization promises force multiplication, but it also brings with it the prospect of reorganization, downsizing, and a reframing of civil-military relations. The information infrastructures that enable us to order a taxi, buy a mortgage, or get goods delivered directly to our door are the same infrastructures that are heralding the military Internet of Things. And we need to be conscious that the benefits of 5G, the Internet of Things, and the challenges that arise out of the fourth industrial revolution will continue to be accrued by those companies and organizations that use infrastructure to influence and shape patterns of public engagement. So let us compare 20th and 21st century models of media production. I think what is clear is that the fact checkers are struggling to keep up with their readers who are producing, publishing and consuming media. And this produces disorientating effects of established perspectives framed by mainstream media, constantly in a state of flux with those who are directly participating in the new media ecology. And this helps to drive the dysphoria that frames the Arendtian and lovely title of Peter Pomerantsev's book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. War is now always on, and it is everywhere. Digitization has made it easier to access stories about the past. At the same time, historical analysis has become throwaway, something that can be tweeted for a particular rhetorical effect before being disregarded. The result is a greater engagement with memory over history, where the past is reinvented in ways that make sense for the present. This is familiar stuff to those who grew up in East and Central Europe, where the archive had purposely been destroyed. In this context, memory supplanted history, and history had to be made to explain occupation, collaboration and subjugation in the context of Nazism and communism. And it seems to me that it is no wonder that Americans and Brits go back to these experiences in the context of disinformation and datafication. Content is being produced all the time. Take, for instance, the images at the bottom of this slide. This is how digital and smartphone technology is being used in real life, by white helmets and their digital cameras in Syria, by those on the front lines taking selfies in Iraq, by those orchestrating, egging on and broadcasting sectarian violence in Northern Ireland, by those appealing for information about their family members who have become prisoners of war, and by those glamorizing war through YouTube in a prelude to the recent Armenia-Azerbaijani war. You don't have to be in the front lines to manipulate these narratives. The relationship between what is being published, what constitutes myth, and what will be remembered has collapsed into itself. And this is reshaping identities along multiple dimensions in a global national dialectic that has yet to be fully understood. This is underpinned by a common experience of media, an experience that we don't often discuss. As these charts from Dr. Michael Witherburn, a data scientist at Imperial College London, demonstrate, memory decay is a noticeable phenomenon of 21st century life. 80% of respondents in this survey said they'd lost information, records or data in the workplace. 71.4% of this was in a digital format. Who keeps 3.5-inch floppy disks or zip drives anymore? What happens when USB is no longer the industry standard? When you break this down further, you see that a vast amount of work is still being undertaken by email, and not just the platforms that we are increasingly making use of to manage workflow across distributed teams. Obviously, this has ramifications for what knowledge is stored and institutionalized, and for tracing decision-making across periods of time. And as John Spencer from the Modern War Institute at West Point attests, this is creating all sorts of problems for how we engage with recent conflict. For while all sorts of historical material about war has been digitized and made available for access across the internet, accessing contemporary data in the context of memory decay is nowhere near as easy as we otherwise imagine. Obviously, this is a problem for those trying to shore up the idea that bombs have been dropped for legitimate reasons or learn lessons that might help avoid future mistakes. So to summarize this part of the presentation, the fluxing representations of war reflects a deeper set of challenges relating to the way technology, mainstream media and people participate in the new war ecology. The way war was represented in media in the 20th century has given way to participant perspectives that upend hierarchical depictions of war, where armed forces and the state want to present war as rational, structured and something that can be controlled. Now we are seeing war from multiple perspectives mediated by the smartphone. So to come back then, how do you deal with this changed war ecology? I've described how people outside the war think and engage in discussions about war, but how do you deal with this question? That if you've dropped bombs, then you've already lost. For a start, information infrastructures underpin your targeting and lessons learned processes. Collecting, sharing and fusing information helps you to identify targets, whether they are for influencing or attacking kinetically. Similarly, collecting, sharing and fusing information helps you to identify and disseminate lessons learned. In a context where you are trying to get inside an adversary's decision-making cycle, much depends on how quickly you can do these things. Your concern for out-innovating adversaries through prototype war reflects the urgency that you believe you face when it comes to achieving successful battlefield outcomes. Processing data at speed drives your interest in AI, autonomous vehicles, and the like. It seems to me it also shapes your ambition to control the media narrative. If you can work more quickly than the billions of people online, then you can potentially shape the information environment more quickly than those who are participating in war. But of course, the problem is that the fourth industrial revolution technologies that enable you to work more quickly and help people to participate in war are also the same technologies that are collapsing long-standing categories of victim, perpetrator, and bystander. Now everyone participates, and that undermines categories that are built around binaries like war and peace, civilian and combatant. This in turn delegitimizes traditional 20th century categories of military power. What is an after-action review when the action is always on? How might you learn lessons in the context of memory decay? How can an inherently hierarchical institution carry out operations at the same speed as adversaries and still maintain political legitimacy? At what point does accelerated warfare escape control of the civil power? Of course, this process is not happening in a uniform way across the planet. In a context of great power competition, we tend to focus on the big disinformation campaigns that shape popular Western opinion, or how, for example, regulation might control data access and use. But what we also find is that there are differing new war ecologies across the world. There was much online concern when Facebook decided to remove all mainstream media news content from its Australian platform following disagreements with the government about regulation. In Myanmar, however, Facebook literally is the internet, and yet our attention was not drawn to how the platform enabled the Rohingya genocide. Similarly, we learned a lot about the Armenia-Azerbaijani war from social media, that it was a testbed for drones and next-generation weapon systems. But what we also see is that Azerbaijan could frame the social media narrative, partly because it had the information infrastructures to do so. So to wrap up then, and to come back to my initial provocation, how do I address this problem? Well, for me, if you're going to understand what this might mean, then it's important to map the new war ecology across the entire breadth of the challenge we face. Why? Because we won't know how to think about the legitimate use of military power unless we understand the politics of violence as it is articulated, spread, and made sense of in different parts of the world. To make the statement that by dropping bombs you have already lost is to imply that kinetic activity has played into a pre-prepared narrative that is designed to delegitimize military activity. To get inside this problem, you need to understand the interplay of factors I've outlined above so that effective counter-strategies can be developed. This cannot be managed simply with some kind of offensive cyber capability. It is not just interrogating the concept of accelerated warfare. It is not just about mapping narratives across different social media platforms and out into mainstream media, something I know we aren't doing very much of, but need to. What we try to do in Radical War is to offer a pathway for understanding war and its representation from the battlefield to the keyboard warrior. This is important, firstly, because the internet is not going to get switched off, so we can't hold back the tide. Secondly, civilian information infrastructures are faster than the military. Thirdly, it seems to me that the gap between the emerging Internet of Things and the emerging military Internet of Things will eventually collapse. And finally, applying categories of understanding from before 9/11 won't help you in a context where everyone participates, where everyone produces, publishes, and consumes media, where everyone has their own sense of reality mirrored back at them in their individualized news feeds. So I draw your attention to my definition of radical war. I do this because it helps understand how military power and its representation produce political effects in the new war ecology. Radical war is the interaction between media spectacle, connected technologies, and the politics of violence. It obscures the relationship between military cause and political effect through a prism of information infrastructures that are opaque and poorly understood, even by those who built them. Everyone participates. Radical war removes bystanders, making everyone either a victim or a perpetrator. Now, the ideas outlined here are an attempt to map what we've described as the new war ecology, in the hope that we can orientate ourselves to the challenges posed by participative war. Personally, I do not think this is a challenge that can be easily resolved by using conceptual categories that don't take into account some fundamental changes in the relationships between war and society, as we discuss in Radical War. I realise that not everyone will agree with the argument I outline here. It is the start of a discussion, however, and it's something that I'm pursuing in my own research agenda. What I hope I've done, though, is to make you want to continue the discussion directly with me in a shared effort to understand the evolving new war ecology. Thank you very much for listening and for giving me some of your time. I hope I can continue these discussions via MS Teams or email or tagging me on Twitter. I should thank Dr. Sandeep Mulgund, Major Scott van der Water, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Lyle, and lastly, my friend Dr. Leo Blanken at MPS for their help and support on preparing this presentation. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ford. So now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of the team session. So feel free to keep submitting your questions through the live event Q&A chat. So our first question is, since you identify social media in this new war ecology, do you think that it's critical to work with and possibly regulate the big tech companies that seem to be at the center of this new war ecology? And do you think that big tech companies believe or know that they are at the center of this new war ecology?
I think there's much discussion, isn't there, around the extent to which big tech wants to collaborate, work with DoD, with the US government generally, and I understand that that's a source of that can be a source of some frustration. I think in the current context in the US, I have every expectation that some form of regulation will happen. I don't know whether that will necessarily produce the kinds of control that you think it might do, though, because I think some of the dynamics that have been unleashed here are not some things that can be just shaped directly by managing or trying to regulate the providers themselves. That's what I'd say in the first instance. I don't know whether that's a I just got to turn my Nicole, maybe you could help me turn this. Well, I don't use media Teams very much. Let me just come over here. I want to turn this slide off. There we go. There we go. I can see you. I can see someone. Sorry about that. Yeah. So I think regulation is probably something that's going to happen, but I'm not sure whether it's going to be enough to stop some of the forces that have been unleashed, really. I think the new war, and I suppose this is part of an ongoing conversation as well. The new war ecology, as far as I'm concerned, is here, and I think it's going to evolve. Right? There's going to be different practices that emerge out of it, and different modes by which some of the things that have happened already will continue to happen. Partly because the processes of datafication are going to bring more and more people online, and all the while that happens, and more people gain something from being online. It's going to be the kind of place where people are going to try and manipulate the way narratives are constructed and framed.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ford. This next question comes from SMA's director, Todd Veazey. And this question is, drawing from your ecology metaphor, which is very powerful, ecologists speak of keystone species in natural systems that have a nonlinear impact of the health of the ecosystem. If removed or altered, these species can create systems collapse or perturbations that are difficult to predict. So you've mentioned social media companies and platforms. Would these be keystone species in the war ecology, and what other keystone species would you point to?
So I think we've got to think about this as in terms of information infrastructures more broadly. And that includes social media, but it's all the way down to the wires, the data centers, and the other various bits and pieces that help build the network. And clearly, that's something that people in this will have a good sense of. Now I think that being able to control that space is precisely why, you know, it's opaque. We don't know what's going. The stack here is not readily easily made transparent, and I think probably you know, social media is clearly at the moment an important part of this ecosystem, but it doesn't seem to me that it's inevitable that they will always be the most important part of the ecosystem. I think it's just the important thing here is that we're seeing how the internet itself is framing how people understand the world, and I think probably the advantages of that will mean that some form of platform will continue, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or something else. Whether the regulation, you know, restricts people, you know, people prefer not to engage in those platforms and they move elsewhere, is to be worked out. I mean, it seems to me that, you know, my teenager probably would be more happy on Instagram than on Twitter. Some of us would be more happy on Facebook than on TikTok, and you know, each one of these different platforms have their own cultures, and I imagine that, you know, they evolve and die out and change over time. And one of the challenges, it seems to me, working in this space is to try and understand the different cultures of these different platforms and how people engage, how memes and how things work semiotically across the platforms, and also how different narratives move between platforms, because they're appealing to different communities, and you can see things move from the edge of the internet back to the center of the internet, you know, from the edge of the internet to what some might call mainstream social media platforms, and then back again, and that's all part of the sort of recycling of narratives, which is important, I think, to track. And I don't think, you'll forgive me, I'm not something I think that is done as well as it might be at the moment, but you know, you guys may know better.
All right, thank you. So speaking of narratives, we have a question from someone that says, have you considered the role that postmodernism plays in this phenomenon, especially as this philosophy seeks to exploit the multiplicity of interpretations of a particular representation, event, or narrative? I was thinking about, I was expecting maybe some sort of question like this. I think you guys, people in uniform have been working to create the facts on the ground for some time. That's how, you know, I was drawn back to, I was thinking about Kosovo and the possibility of trying to actually be at an airfield in Kosovo in the late 1990s. So when the Russians arrived, the phrase was, we would create the facts on the ground. We'd already controlled the airfield. And it seems to me that the challenge now is to create the facts in the new war ecology. And in that respect, you know, yes, there is something postmodern about what I'm describing, but there is also something about how facts are constructed and become understood as facts. And I think one of the challenges of the new war ecology really is that whereas experts previously had a key role in shaping some kind of sense of objective truth, obviously experts are on the web and are open to being, you know, it's a leveling experience to have experts with the general public, and experts have to figure out how to communicate to the general public in a way that you know, shows that they're engaged and thinking and can answer questions in a way that makes sense to the general public. Otherwise they turn around and, you know, I've been on Twitter long enough to know that if I say something, I can quickly get taken down by someone who has experienced something differently, and I think that's just that there is it seems to me that is a permanent challenge of this environment. I don't think that's going to change necessarily. Okay, thank you. Oh, all right. So this next question comes from Frag from A3. And the question is, we had a recent discussion about ethics and operations in the information environment. There's a perception, perhaps, that the more flexible views that an authoritarian regime might take about putting information out there into the environment gives them an advantage over Western democracies. How would you say that we flip the script using the insights from your research?
Thanks, Frank. I think, you know, firstly, I think we need to face up to the fact that this is, you know, if we're going to defend liberal democracy, then we have to start on the basis that we take the notion of liberal democracy seriously. And I think that means we have to accept that, you know, as I said in my talk, this is not Sparta, and we're not authoritarian regimes. So we, you know, clearly getting inside the information, the narrative creation cycle of those who are trying to say bad things about liberal democracies means a lot of work needs to be done before hard power gets used. And it seems to me that that's where the main challenge really lies for us. And that's why I'm keen to sort of point out that we need to understand what these new war ecologies are, because, you know, if you find yourselves deployed to a part of the world that you haven't even heard of, maybe, let alone know what's going on there, not having a sense of how society is structured and politics works both online and offline, you know, it's pretty easy to blunder into all sorts of problems and create all sorts of messages and narratives that just reinforce the perspectives that are being used to frame how your military action is being portrayed. So, you know, for me, a lot of this really comes down to even more preparatory work to try to get inside what how new war ecologies work, even before we get to a position where armed forces and military power are applied. And I suppose the obvious analogy for me is area studies in the 60s and 70s. You know, when we're thinking about how to manage the international system in parts of the world where insurgencies, civil wars, and the like are going on, expertise is needed in what was going on in these countries. We needed more people who were appreciating and more importantly, for that information to be more widely available, so that everyone could learn something about different parts of the world. And some of that kind of stuff comes from the sorts of things like aid and where people are actually going out and building connections and networks. And of course, that's a long way away from, right, that implies, it seems to me, some kind of, dare I suggest it, an integrated foreign defence security policy and aid policy as well. But clearly that's a long way away from the provocation that I put to you around dropping bombs and already having lost, which I say, Frank, I'm very grateful to you, because it was in conversations that we had that statement came out, and it was just so intriguing. I thought I'd spend a bit of time looking at it a bit more. I hope I've done justice to the question you asked.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ford. The next question is, given this new ecology, what effect does it have on the will to wage war? If an entity is not sensitive to popular criticism, then it would seem that it has a major advantage in sustaining its will to continue fighting.
Well, I think that there's a permanent challenge of trying to maintain good civil-military relations at home and to understand what is motivating people to fight overseas. And that challenge hasn't necessarily changed, but clearly through a prism of these contemporary information infrastructures, through the new war ecology, actually understanding, developing a deeper understanding of what's going on the one hand looks easier, but also it seems to me it's been made more complex, because there are just so many more different communities, networks, online networks, and its analog equivalent, and trying to understand all of that, clearly increases the complexity. Partly because everyone is involved in this now, it seems to me, and from our point of view, I mean, I think one of the things the question is whether some kind of, I was thinking about this in terms of the guys working in information operations more broadly, they're having to work in a context that's set by government, more wider government, they've got to work within a hierarchy themselves, and so the speed at which they can get you can get your own messages out is clearly made more complex by the structures that you're having to work within. And that, of course, makes things more complex, generally speaking. But that comes back to me, from my point of view, comes back to how to reinforce the legitimate use of military power and maintain that as a central feature of what it is that we do, so that we don't run into the kinds of challenges that otherwise might emerge as a result of being misrepresented by adversaries and those who are trying to upset what we might be trying to do. I hope that answers your question. Gets there somewhere.
I think it does. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Okay. So this next question comes from Art Huber from Air Force Materiel Command. And the question is, does your metaphor of bombs in the information environment, question moved all the way down to the bottom. Does your question of bombs in the radical war extend to non-kinetic or virtual meaning behind the kinetic? Can the information nature of radical war create an unsolvable conundrum even for those who eschew kinetic means? And what does this ultimately mean for how we should define victory?
Yes, I think the root of the challenge is that what's going on now is not just that you're having to fight war, but you're having to construct a reality around that, and that is even more complex than, you've got sophisticated systems to allow you to drop munitions and apply military power, but it's even more complex, it seems to me, when you're trying to shape the people's perspectives. Dropping a bomb on a bridge may have some military utility, but if it's being portrayed in narrative terms in ways that undermine your overall objective, then maybe dropping the bombs on the bridge might not be the best way to go about doing it. So this sort of inverts the idea that well, I mean, this is something that I think people in uniform have grasped quite. The last 20 years has been really, information is center and military operations follows. Winning that narrative is also a real challenge, and I think you might find that questions around victory need to be absolutely framed in terms of how you might have to construct the realities that you need to relate the victory back to the narrative construction that you're and the reality construction that you're pursuing, and that clearly is something that needs to be thought through for a domestic audience as well as for those overseas. And of course that's really complicated because there are many different interpretations, but I don't but I think that is an inevitable function of people participating in the way that they are now, especially given that people can use their smartphone very quickly to put up a counter narrative. That's the core of the challenge, isn't it? And I'm not even sure that even with sophisticated AI, if you could ever get to that point, you would be able to counter that. Right. That's why I say this new war ecology is really deeply problematic in my mind, because there are so many voices that are enabled through it. I don't think I've necessarily answered your question as well as I might, but I think what I'm pointing at here is precisely what the problem is. You know, unless we start to map this new war ecology, unless we start to get inside and across the range of things, or across data, attention, and control, I think, and we see the way things are interrelate, I think it's going to be even harder to develop the kinds of solutions that you all very much need.
All right, thanks, Dr. Ford. All right, so this next question is: radical war may remove bystanders, but does it really make everyone a victim or a perpetrator? Might it make most of us voyeurs?
It seems to me that the obvious metaphor here is that when people inadvertently online retweeting something or sharing something, and they don't know that the message is actually nefarious, they're victims. They're not. I don't know whether they can be described as bystanders, and they are also perpetrators, right? So in that respect, that's why I say that they are participating. It seems to me also the fact that you know, as the Internet of Things really takes hold, it seems to me that we are just providing data points for all sorts of targeting activities more broadly. So even if we don't, you know, even if you have your phone on you but you're not actively using it, it still becomes a sensor, and that can still be used as part of a targeting cycle. So you know, in that respect, whether we may be unwitting participants, but we're still participating, and I think that's just a function of us putting more of our lives online. You know, just being more connected. It's just a function of connected technology more broadly. That would be my take on it. And I think that, I mean, that clearly, if you start to think about that, that really does have some really quite serious, in my mind, and quite challenging implications, which need quite a bit of care to unpack and think through.
All right, thank you. Okay, so next we have a question from GK Allen from the Joint Staff. And this question is: there's a debate within the information operations community about whether there is a difference between the information environment and the operational environment of the Joint Force Commander. Do you believe that the IE and the OE are two different environments or ecologies?
That is a very good question to ask a British academic, civilian academic. In fact, so good, I'm not entirely convinced I can give you a meaningful or sensible answer. It seems to me, though, that there are clearly ways of working within the information operations community that need to be attuned to and engage with, and have some means by which it's possible to get outside the wire. It's outside the wire where there's lots of interesting things to be understood and mapped. And, you know, that wider, you know, the military, it seems to me, are a part of this ecology, and not even necessarily the most important bit of the ecology. And civil society, you know, is busily doing what it does online, and in come various people trying to shape narratives, move propaganda around the place, you know, and the social media storm goes this way or goes that way. Now, you know, is anyone? You know, with although military power is important to us, as because this is where we work, or what we're interested in, or it's not necessarily, it seems to me, something that is at the forefront of everyone else's perspectives. And I think I see that idea when I start to talk to people in uniform, and I think to myself, what I think to myself is that actually there's a whole heap of life going on online that doesn't connect with the way you guys are talking about the information environment. And I suppose the New War Ecology is an attempt to try and bring that idea firmly back into your orbit, to remind you that you're actually, I mean, when you get out of uniform, obviously you're using your smartphones. You've got your Fitbit device, you've got your devices on, and you're loading stuff up to Strava. So you understand what's going on, but I don't think the people in uniform are necessarily the most important bit of this. If you get my drift, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. And a challenging question to a British academic, but thank you for tackling it.
I wish I could answer it.
Okay, so Todd has asked another question, and this question is, your research is absolutely fascinating. The US military has suffered from a malady of fighting the last war, which is often unsuitable to the present circumstances. Looking at radical war has been a fundamental change in the character of war. What should we be researching to look ahead and break the fighting the last war cycle?
So I think that's a really good question. I mean, for me, I think there's a couple of things that has really struck me as being really important in terms of future research. One is around civil military relations. It seems to me that we need to start to understand how, and people are, there's some good people over in the States, and I'm doing some work, trying to do some work on it as well. What the information infrastructures that are underpinning the work that everyone's doing here, they are opaque, and it seems to me that we need to have some better sense as to how they work, so that we can reinforce the way that civil military relations work in a legitimate way. And it's about putting that legitimacy back in, that political legitimacy back into the structures, so that when armed force is used, everyone understands that it's being used in a way that conforms with constitutional processes. So that's number one for me. Number two, it seems to me that we need to get, it's very easy to look at the world through our own engagement with social media and media generally, right? And then we forget that there is all this other stuff going on in other parts of the world, that where the television or our particular online social media platform does not give us the information that's going on in that part of the world. And it seems to me it's really important to try and get into some of that stuff, to try and understand the specific ecologies. How is it that Facebook was used in order to promote the genocide in Myanmar? Once we start to get inside that, it's when you realize that Facebook is packaged up with smartphones, and even if you don't take a data package with when you buy the smartphone in Myanmar, you still get access to Facebook. No wonder then Facebook becomes a dominant platform through which people engage with everything online. That becomes the internet for them. And I think it's those kinds of moves that we need to understand when it comes to thinking through how political violence might work in these parts of the world. Right? We need to get inside that. So that's number. There's one of the bubbles I put up on my research agenda was around future memory. That seems a bit odd, maybe, but it seems to me that it's connected to the idea that people are getting involved in politics, and they're filming themselves, maybe doing stuff that could be used by the police and security services later on to prosecute them, but they're filming themselves to amplify, firstly, to say that they were there. And in that respect, it's sort of it's a sort of notion that there's a future memory. They want the T-shirt, right? They want to say that they were there. I can see that in Northern Ireland right now. There's a lot of kids who are there's a Brexit-related stuff going on in Northern Ireland. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but kids are filming some of this stuff. A lot of good photos coming out, and of course they're covering their faces. Of course, some of that might then be used by the police service in Northern Ireland to prosecute them, but at the same time, they've got the personal record of them being involved in that moment. And so a lot of this stuff is storing data that allows you to then reflect on what you've done in the past, and that becomes a source of political motivation later on down the line. So that's what I mean by things like future. Some things seem, obviously stupid. If you're recording yourself, of course you're going to get caught, right? That's a data point. But at the same time, it's a bit like going to a gig and buying the T-shirt and putting your phone up and watching the band, and you've now got a memory of that particular event, and that's intriguing to me. There's a lot of instances of that.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ford. So we're getting close to the end of the hour. However, Dr. Ford has agreed to go over by a little bit to answer the remaining questions. Looks like we still have about 6. But before we at least wrap up for the end of the hour, for those that have to leave at the end of the hour, Felix B asked, after saying that you had a great presentation, and thank you for presenting your intrinsic themes in such a way. He asks, when do you fathom that your book will be available for purchase?
That's a good question.
So
it's a great question. It's currently under review, and I hope it will be out in the next in the next 9 months. That's what I hope. But obviously a few negotiations to have still. But I can't wait to get the book out as well, because then I can share properly and engage more fully. But I guess all the while, I mean, this is one of the great things about this event is actually that there's an opportunity to talk to the likes of yourselves, and start conversations, because I realise that some of these ideas are quite can be quite challenging, and I realise I'm putting myself out there, so I'm sort of in that respect, and my co-author as well. We're putting ourselves out there, but we're trying to provoke a conversation in order to stretch some arguments and see whether we can get some people to engage with us and see how far we can take it. So I'm, even if the book's not out, then I'm very happy to carry on the discussion online, Twitter, or send me an email, as you like.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ford. All right, so the next question in our Q&A is, there are thousands of pieces of information and news out constantly, but the shifts seem to come from the viral moment, a process that's obviously not as well understood or would be already in use. Since the same event can be portrayed from opposite angles and create different narratives, is creation and control of the viral moments a new arms race, and should it be a major focus of our efforts?
I don't know. Well, I say that I just saw a tweet about Chinese diplomacy and how it had the Chinese amplifying particular Chinese narrative involved something like 70,000 accounts that were subsequently closed because they were not actually, they were spreading some kind of disinformation, or some kind of, they were trolling or something, some way, shape or form. So clearly the online environment allows for the creation of accounts and manipulation of narratives. Quantity and quality, there's been some great stuff by Rand and others who've been talking about how data is, how information is laundered and amplified and made use of by multiple accounts. Clearly that is something that's buffeting online life, and buffeting it in a really rather dramatic ways at times. And it would be something that either an offensive cyber, offensive information operation, or something, I could see why people might be inclined, thinking that this is an appropriate way to counter or set up a counter narrative. I think that the touchstone here has to be, for me anyway, whether we can hand on heart say it's a legitimate thing to do, and greater good arguments, I think, can only carry us so far, There has to be something in here around the rule of law and what we as citizens would want to see in terms of how we would want to behave at our best. And I understand, though, that may feel like the armed forces have one hand tied behind their back, but I think there are better ways and more legitimate ways of pursuing an information war that don't necessarily involve all of the clearly, and I don't think trying to build some kind of resilience, the fact-checking approach is clearly not going to work, it seems to me. So some other means by which the narratives can be framed and people can understand what is legitimate or not seems to me to be really important. And we need to work on that as a matter of some urgency, it seems to me.
All right, so what I believe is sort of a related question comes from Matthew Duncan from Defense R&D in Canada. And he says, you can make the distinction between any opinions and beliefs versus informed opinions and beliefs, where the latter are based on a rigorous, honest, evidence-based process. So do you have any ideas about whether this distinction can be a driver for finding solutions to the problems that we see in the information environment?
I think that the main challenge here in this contemporary information environment and the dysphoria that we are experiencing is that actually that the kind of thing that you've just described, Matthew, is the thing that I think is most challenged. People, the extent to which people might or might not care in a throwaway comment about what might be considered to be true or fact or historically accurate. I think that we need to be very careful about that now. And I think that it sort of goes back to how experts themselves are not as relevant in the, people like me, we're not just not as relevant in a social media environment. The blue tick social media community clearly have very strong voices. But for every one of those, there are lots and lots of other people who are putting up counter narratives, and I think that implies that how society creates some sense of socially accepted truth has changed, and I don't think that's something that there's an easy answer to. And I think we certainly need to, it used to be the case that, respected professions would help create socially acceptable truths, lawyers, doctors, surveyors, and the like. They were crucial for making society work because they would agree, they would create standards and agree what was factual and what wasn't. Now, clearly, those communities still have a great deal of importance in society, but there are other voices that have been raised up that are countering them. It might be a function of PR or of the influence industry more broadly, and that itself is maybe something that needs to be accounted for in terms of how we think about what might constitute a socially agreed fact. It's not an easy answer. I'm sure you. I'd like to be able to say here I've got all the answers, but I think I've also said that we're talking about this as an ecology in terms of an evolution of ideas, really, and a series of discussions that I think we need to have societally.
All right, thank you. So this next question is commonly heard is that the character of war is changing, but its nature, political contest waged through violence is not. Does radical war change the nature of war?
I think, this is a Clausewitzian question. I think what I've described is something where Clausewitz doesn't, Clausewitz is clearly something that the armed forces themselves typically organise themselves around. But it doesn't seem to me that Clausewitz is necessarily going to explain or help us understand or make sense of some of the things that are going on now. There are new things that are happening now, and there is a new sense of reality, constructing reality in real time alongside the use of military power. I don't think it has inverted some of the things that we might take as central to how armed force works. And so for my money, I don't think Clausewitz is as relevant in this circumstance as we otherwise. I mean, partly because a lot of the things that we're talking about are in the grey zone. Technically, this is not war. This is political violence below the threshold of war. And if it's political violence, then why apply a Clausewitzian framework? There are other ways of thinking about political violence that don't necessarily involve Clausewitz, and they may be more useful, it seems to me, in this context than Clausewitz. So it's a duck of your question. I think there is, if full-blown war is not the norm, and I can't say that won't be the case, because there are different states pursuing different objectives. But if the state system itself starts to erode through as a result, as a product of information infrastructures being, Silicon Valley, if Facebook is better is going to outgovern government, you can get better insights as to how to govern through Facebook. Then, they're making a pitch for becoming a core utility of the state, right? Core infrastructure of the state, and in there's the possibility that the state as we know it starts to evolve or erode. And that, I think, will change the relationship between state and technology and military power. And that might mean something more fundamental in terms of nature and character. It's a bit of a duck, but not as much of a duck as I might have expected to offer you now.
No worries, thank you. So John Catherall from DSTL in the UK brought up a comment that relates to a previous question that Todd asked about keystone species. So he said, the keystone species question is insightful, but modern digital ecology is importantly different. He says, one, the electronics is actually very fragile. True dispersed self-healing is a long way off. So we could be heading for, could we be heading for a collapse? And two, in contrast, our evolution is much faster. So how fast and transformative can we go? Any comments?
John, having been someone who used to work at DSTL, it's always nice to hear someone from the UK, and with a nice curveball question as well. It seems to me that we have, even within, I mean, done a lot of work in. I spent a bit of time in main building in the Ministry of Defence, and I've been thinking a bit about the information ecosystem in the UK when it comes to defence. And it seems to me that the ecosystem, there are multiple ecosystems. They work as you say, they're fragile, but they work at different speeds, and they have they create different data trajectories, and that causes and the cycles times in which things happen. Even within the armed forces compared to the rest of the world, it just seems to me, or outside the wire, how many times have I heard someone in uniform say, why can't we just have something delivered, sent to us like Amazon delivers something to us, as opposed to us having to fill in a green screen or send something in triplicate or something along those lines to get something delivered that's more expensive and doesn't work quite as well as if you got it delivered online. It seems to me that those kinds of things are exactly the source of some friction here, and I think you must be right when it comes to there being a degree of fragility, but there's also, it seems to me, different speeds and points of acceleration around the networks that we need to think through when it comes to trying to map and manage and understand and engage this idea of an ecology. So that's I think that's my initial response, but I'd be happy, do drop me an email and we can carry on the conversation.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ford. So this last question is another great one from Todd. So this question to wrap us up is, you mentioned the necessity for studying or analyzing the new war ecology in order to operate in it. It seems that our intelligence analysts lack the methodologies to do that presently. Have you given some thought as to what this would actually require in practical terms? What education, skills, and trainings would be required?
So I think it's a great question. I think I'll give you a quick analogy, right? It seems to me that historians in the future are going to need to understand how to access the kinds of data archives that are keeping, firstly, the archives themselves are going to be distributed across lots of different platforms. There'll be lots of data that's, you're going to need to do a lot of data cleaning. You're going to need to, and people are going to need to understand how to layer some kind of search engine over the top of them. Then they're going to be looking for patterns as well as for details. There's going to be too much information, and they're going to need to understand how to wrap all of that together in such a way that they might be able to tell some kind of narrative. It implies that historians and history as a field might have to work collaboratively, or it might have to work collaboratively with people working in informatics, or others who are used to mining data in order to generate the kinds of insights that would allow us to draw out some really meaningful lessons learned, or dare I say, just history. Right? And it seems to me that those kinds of firstly, some of the methods, some of the computing methods need to become more available. Right. So some of the underlyings, they need to become user friendly. They need to be something that anyone can use to interrogate. Is it just a Google search slapped over the top of a load of data? Probably not. But do people need to be made have more sophisticated search and engagement strategies with the data that there's available? I think almost certainly they do. Is there something that higher education, universities, and other research centres need to push forwards? It seems to me that that's an inevitability. And in terms of my own research agenda, I am keen to go and do some work on what I described as the new war ecology. But firstly, I've got to be thinking about putting a team together that can apply technologies, that some of which have not been properly fully developed or are available, in a context in which social media platforms themselves are becoming more careful about what they will and won't share, which on the one hand, there's an educational dimension to this. But if we go back to Cambridge Analytica, the whole Cambridge Analytica stuff completely pulled the rug under our feet in some ways as well, because Facebook closed down, and just doing it, it's crystal clear, it seems to me, that people spend a huge amount of their lives. Smartphone technology is ubiquitous and is almost mundane, and we spend a lot of our time. How many times do you look at your kids or your family members and they've got their heads in their phones or their iPads or their computers, and yet actually understanding what they're doing there, unless you interrupt them, is or you track their IP address on your home router, you're not gonna see what they're doing. And yet we clearly do need to have some sense of that, and those skills need to be more transferable. So one of the things I would like to do at Sussex is do some work on semiotics and visual and memes data that would allow me to look at the image as a part of a narrative construction, across multiple media platforms, from mainstream media all the way through to social media, so that we could start mapping what I would describe as the media ecology, the war ecology. And I can say that to Professor David Weir at Sussex, who's got a informatics lab specializing in some of this stuff, and then he turns around and says, well, some of this technology I actually have to build in order to make that happen. Right now, what we're seeing, I think, is that our understanding of what's going on compared to what is going on is a couple of steps behind what is actually going on. And we need to push that along a bit quicker if we're going to start to even conceptualize the breadth of the problem that I think you guys in particular are really trying to work through. Because it seems to me fundamentally not easy, and in those circumstances, it seems almost more likely that mistakes and accidents and silly things happen, and we need to make sure that in those circumstances we are using what we are doing things on a legitimate basis. We really, that's the way it seems to me that we maintain the point that Western societies, the United States, UK, Europe, whatever, are different from those parts of the world that don't necessarily think about those things. So, and I realise that's when things move quickly and people in uniform need to work quickly. I realise that's not very helpful as an answer from a civilian who's put you in the difficult spot of actually having to do these things. But it seems to me that that's an essential answer, a number one answer.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ford. And thank you everyone for tuning into today's team session. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I see that we got one question towards the very end of the Q&A here. So David D, please feel free to shoot me an email and I'll send your question over to Dr. Ford. But thank you everyone for your time today. And thank you again, Dr. Matthew Ford, for taking the time to present today.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right, have a good day, everyone.